everybody, welcome back to a brand new video, and today I'm going to be talking about the 25th Amendment, which deals with presidential and vice presidential succession. And I'm also going to be talking about multiple times in American history where the office of the vice president has been vacant. So let's get into it, and make sure to like and subscribe because I'm a brand new channel, so everything goes a long way. Ready, everybody, so let's get into it. You guys know the drill by now. Here's the presentation. So what exactly is the 25th Amendment? Well, there's actually four different sections to the 25th Amendment, and they each deal with different scenarios. So let's get into it. Section 1 clarified that when the vice president becomes president, they actually assume the office of the president instead of just assuming the duties and the powers of the president. And I get that's probably a little confusing, so I have a slide here to further explain Section 1 in detail. So this first happened in 1841 when William Henry Harrison died a month into office. Now, the 25th Amendment wasn't passed until 1967, but this case in 1841 set a very important precedent for how presidential succession actually happens. So, if you know anything about William Henry Harrison and his vice president, John Tyler, you know their little campaign song, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. William Henry Harrison gave a super long speech when he was inaugurated, and he ended up catching pneumonia or something. I think he gave a speech out in the rain, and back then I guess you couldn't do that because we had no medicine. So he got pneumonia, and he died about a month into office. And when he died, it was actually an unprecedented event. At this stage in American history, we had never had a president die in office. And Article 2 of the Constitution actually accounts for this, but it states that in case of the removal of the president from office, or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. So pre 1841, it was thought that if the president were to die in office, then the vice president would merely assume the duties and powers of the presidency. They wouldn't actually ascend to the office of the presidency themselves. They would only assume the duties and the powers. And so people didn't know if Vice President Tyler would assume the office of the presidency or just the office's duties. But John Tyler actually asserted that he assumed the actual office, and he even took the presidential oath. And this set a very, very clear precedent that if the president were to die in office, the vice president actually becomes the president instead of just assuming their powers. Now, I hope that makes sense. It's a little convoluted. It can get a little confusing. And John Tyler actually wasn't sure if he should take the presidential oath, but in order to squash any claims that he wasn't actually president, he decided to go ahead and take the oath anyways. So John Tyler, strong man, set a very clear precedent in 1841. So let's look at Section 2 of the 25th Amendment. Now, Section 2 actually deals with vice president vacancies. So what happens if the office of the vice president was vacant, if there was no one to fill it? Now, pre 1967, there had been several times in American history when the office of the vice presidency was vacant until the next election, and there was actually no way to fill it. Now, I'm going to discuss that in further detail on the next slide. And nowadays, because of Section 2 of the 25th Amendment, the president can nominate a new vice president and have them voted on in Congress. Now, they need to have a majority in the House and the Senate, and if they have that, then that person becomes the new vice president. Now, what times has the vice president office been vacant? Well, there's been several. And I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to move my webcam here so you guys can see this chart. I'm going to go ahead and make my webcam a little smaller. Alrighty, here we go. So, Section 2 continued. Nixon was actually the first person to use Section 2 to confirm a successor. So for him, Spiro Agnew resigned, as you can see down here. You can see my little cursor. 1973 to December 6, 1973, October 10th to December 6th, the office of the vice presidency was vacant, and Nixon was able to use the 25th Amendment, which was ratified in 1967, to actually confirm a successor. Now, as you see here, the vice presidency was vacant for 57 days, and Spiro Agnew, actually, I think he ended up resigning because of some ethics issues. But as you see, there's been plenty of times when the office of the vice presidency was actually vacant, but it hasn't been vacant in a long while. So, like I state, Ford, after Nixon, was the last person to actually have to invoke Section 2 of the 25th Amendment. As you can see, that happened in 1974 from August 9th to December 13th, so 132 days. That happened when Nixon resigned. Gerald Ford became the President of the United States, actually the only unelected President of the United States. I'll probably make a video on that one day because Gerald Ford, he wasn't voted in at all. He never won an election to become President of the United States. So he was the last time that Section 2 had to be invoked. And there has been no vacancy since 1974. But imagine if something like Kamala Harris were to die in office. Section 2 would have to be invoked in order for President Biden to actually confirm a new successor to become vice president. It's not as simple as with the presidency. If the president were to die, the vice president becomes the new president. But if the vice president were to die, there's no system like that. So the president actually has to confirm manually a new successor, going through both chambers of Congress. Now, as you can see, the longest vice president vacancy was actually John Tyler's presidency. And that was almost a full term that happened without there being a vice president. So as you can see here, I'm circling it with my cursor. 1841, April 4th to March 4th, 1845. So 3 years and 334 days we went without having a vice president. And we already talked about John Tyler and William Henry Harrison on the slide previous. So now let's talk about Section 3. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move my webcam back over. You guys saw the meme that I put there. So Section 3 is where the president can voluntarily give the vice president the powers of the presidency, usually temporarily, until he requests in writing his powers and duties back. Now, historically, this has happened for a number of reasons, but mostly surgery. You may have remembered that a few years ago, relatively recently, President Biden had to go through surgery, and he temporarily invoked Section 3 of the 25th Amendment to give the powers and duties of the office of the presidency to Vice President Kamala Harris. And President George W. Bush, had done that previously. He gave Dick Cheney the powers and duties of office while he went in for a colonoscopy. Now, here's a very funny story. It's actually been reported that in order to avoid giving up power, Donald Trump went through a colonoscopy without anesthesia to avoid having to give up power. Now, love him or hate him, that's pretty gangsta. And you got to put some respect on his name for that. So, here we go. I can make my webcam bigger. Who needs to see that much of Joe Biden? So, Section 4. Section 4 allows the vice president, along with a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of such other body as Congress may by law provide, to declare the sitting president unable to carry out their duties. Now, you've probably heard calls for this lately. Some people have thought that Kamala Harris should invoke the 25th Amendment to deem Joe Biden unable to carry out his duties due to advanced mental decline. Now, is that going to happen? No. They only made him drop out because they realized he couldn't win. It had nothing to do with his mental decline, even though he is in mental decline. It's been obvious for years. But my opinions aside, let's look at this even further. The vice president only becomes acting president. They do not assume the office of the presidency. So that's something that's important to note. So if Kamala Harris were to deem Joe Biden unable to carry out the duties of the office, she wouldn't actually become president herself. She would just start carrying out the duties and powers of the office. So Joe Biden would technically stay in office. He would just be powerless. And the president can actually counter this. So if the president doesn't agree that he is unable, he can actually declare himself able in writing. And if he does that, a 4-day countdown period starts, and this is real. This seems very memey, but a 4-day countdown period starts where the VP still has the powers of the office of the presidency, but needs to issue a second declaration, and Congress needs to vote on it. So Congress has to decide by 2/3. A 2/3 majority is needed in both the House of Representatives and the Senate to deem the president unable to carry out the duties and powers of office. And if you actually know, that's actually stricter than impeachment. So to impeach a president, you only need a House majority and 2/3 in the Senate. But to deem a president unable to carry out the duties and powers of office, you need 2/3 in both chambers of Congress, which I find to be very interesting. So, what are some of my final thoughts? Well, nowadays, because of the 25th Amendment, we should no longer have a VP vacancy for more than a few months. If Kamala Harris or JD Vance or I can't even think of that new person Kamala picked today, if any of them were in office elected and ended up dying in office or becoming incapacitated for any reason or even resigning, the president can actually now go through the process of confirming a new vice president. So we shouldn't have what we had with John Tyler and William Henry Harrison, where we had a vacancy for more than 3 years. Now, theoretically, that can still happen if Congress just refuses to nominate anyone and no one gets a majority, but we shouldn't have a VP vacancy for more than a few months. So it's also interesting that we've had close to a full presidential term in the past where there wasn't a VP with John Tyler. I mean, I don't think a lot of people have realized that our country has spent a significant amount of time where the office of the vice president was actually vacant. And another thing I want to point out is how one individual can set a precedent and define history with John Tyler. So, like I pointed out, before John Tyler, people thought that if the president were to die in office, then the vice president would only assume the powers and duties of the president. However, John Tyler set a clear and strong precedent that that individual actually became the president themselves and had to be sworn in. And that's an example of a strong man setting a very, very important precedent. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe. And please, if you haven't already, watch my other videos. Consider giving them a chance because I'm a brand new channel. And like I've said before, every little thing you do at this point goes a very long way. And if you have any ideas or any suggestions, make sure to comment them down below. Thank you guys for watching and have a great day.